And you're live on YouTube.
Great. 1 second, just one more thing I want to find. Okay. Okay, hi everyone. Hello and welcome to another webinar organized by the International Manifesto Group. As most of you will know, the International Manifesto Group is an international socialist and anti-imperialist group supporting the emergence of a multi- and pluripolar world. Our most important activity is the holding of these webinars about twice a month, informing audiences of around the world on key moments and developments that have and are shaping the struggle for a multipolar, equal, peaceful, and sustainable world. Please check us out at the International Manifesto Group website, which is at www.internationalmanifesto.org. Please also share our events and videos widely. We post all these webinars on and the individual contributions on the International Manifesto Group YouTube page. And please also consider supporting us in any other way you can by subscribing to our YouTube channel, signing up for our newsletter, and supporting us with any donations that you can manage. Please also consider reading our manifesto and signing it. My name is Radhika Desai. I am the convener of the International Manifesto Group, and I will moderate this event. Our topic today is the Cold War Reconstitution of Imperialism, and the subtitle is Churchill's Fulton speech and the Greek Civil War. Both of these events are 80 years old this year. In popular understanding, the Cold War was an ideological contest between capitalism and communism, between the West and the East, and specifically between the United States and the Soviet Union, and of course also with China at a certain point in history. It is also understood that the Cold War maintained peace through regular and nuclear arms and the enormous stockpiling of both regular and nuclear arms and the threat of mutually assured destruction. Most people think that both sides in it were equally imperialist, and that it ended with the victory of the capitalist side, proving that the Soviet system, and generally speaking socialism, was economically, politically, and militarily coupled. These views were actually already false when at the height of the Cold War. From our vantage point today, with the West in a precipitous decline and the US waging a horrifically superfluous and exceedingly dangerous war, endangering lives and livelihoods around the world, threatening food, fuel, and environmental catastrophes, even more holes are appearing in this understanding. And I'd just like to enumerate some 7 points that I think are important to consider. Was the Cold War, in which the West turned against its own allies of World War II, an ideological contest or the pursuit of imperialism through other means, made necessary thanks to the declining imperial capacities of the West, symbolized in no small terms by the onset of decolonization, which were of course also supported by the communist countries of the time, and also taking place under new leadership of the imperialist countries, the leadership of the United States, thanks to the boost that the Second World War, and for that matter the First World War, gave to the US economy, and the destruction it wreaked on those of its allies. By that I mean its new Western allies. Indeed, wasn't the Cold War central also to the US project of asserting supremacy over European and Japanese allies? With current tensions in NATO particularly blown up, open by the war on Iran, one hopes that the truth about the relationship between the United States and its allies will out. One hopes that the truth about how the United States subordinated its allies, for instance, by twisting the UK's arm over the loans it desperately needed after the Second World War, and of course how it intervened bloodily in the Greek Civil War to make Greece today the nation not just spending more of its GDP on NATO armaments than any other NATO country, but doing so while being among those least capable of doing so. Greece today continues to spend huge amounts on NATO armaments despite the severe economic blows it suffered after the Greek crisis of the 2010s, about a decade and more ago. And perhaps it will finally emerge that the US was no leader or hegemon, but always a mafia state, offering protection from dangers it generated itself, not just in the Third World, but also among its allies. One hopes this will end talk of special relations like the UK-US special relationship, and also set back, if not dismantle, the Atlanticist project, the project that lies at the core of the Cold War, and more fundamentally at the core of the reconstitution of imperialism after the Second World War. Secondly, wasn't the new alliance of imperialist powers that Churchill was calling for in his Fulton speech simply a proposal for the reconstitution of the imperialist alliance, albeit in reduced circumstances, against what he called the world organization, by which he clearly meant the United Nations, whose emergence left him so apprehensive? He, more than most, would have resented Britain, so recently presiding over the empire on which the sun never set, having to treat old colonial subjects and their leaders with the respect normally given to peers. Thirdly, was the anti-communist ideological coloring simply a necessary manifestation of the fact that over the previous 3 fateful decades of crises of both capitalism and imperialism, the communist country bloc had emerged as the cutting edge of anti-imperialist forces, with the Bolsheviks publishing the secret treaties of that led to the First World War, along with their peace decree, demanding self-determination for all the colonies. And let's remember that Wilson limited his demand for self-determination to European countries. Sorry, just lost my notes here. Of course, the support that the communist bloc, the Soviet Union, China, and other communist countries gave to anti-colonial movements around the world, no matter how much they had been restrained by post-war pacts like Yalta. Fourthly, what was the content of imperialism? Was it just a willful domination of the world, or was it systematically connected to the needs of maintaining capitalism in the Western countries by opening up the rest of the world's economies to US corporate penetration for markets, for investment outlets, for cheap inputs and cheap labor, with only the realities of the geopolitical economy of the post-war world, the strength of communist and nationalist forces constituting constraints on the actions of the United States in particular and the West in general. Fifthly, when did the Cold War actually begin? Did it begin in 1946 with the Fulton speech or the US intervention in the Greek Civil War? Or was it already, was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 already the opening sort of salvo of the Cold War? Recent historical research has shown that rather than being necessary to save 500,000 American lives that would have been lost with an invasion of Japan, in reality, with Japan already suing for peace, the nuclear bombs were dropped in order to show the Soviet Union what mighty arms the US now possessed, and in the hope that this would ensure that it would be kept in its place. and prevented from extending its influence beyond its borders. Sixthly, how was the Cold War experience in the Soviet Union and China? And I must say that on this subject, a lot more research is probably needed, research in which our colleagues from Russia today and colleagues studying China that are joining us in this panel will contribute. Notwithstanding the widespread pox on both your houses understanding that was shared even on the left, it's my understanding that the posture of the East in this Cold War was always defensive, and that of the West always offensive. The Warsaw Pact, for instance, was not created until a full 5 years after the creation of NATO, and that only because Germany finally joined NATO. And finally, not the least reason why we must question these understandings is that both the expectations that were very much abroad at the end of the disintegration of the Soviet Union have been belied. That is, we are not living in a unipolar world, and the world has not enjoyed a peace dividend. On the contrary, the world has become multipolar, and partly as a consequence, the aggressive actions of the West, now unconstrained by the existence of the Soviet Union, have only multiplied. To address these and many other questions, we have brought together a most distinguished and insightful panel of scholars, historical thinkers, and all of them, and they will help us to understand the Cold War and relate it to the hot wars that have been so prolific since its end. And are, of course, reaching a crescendo today. We have 5 speakers, and I will introduce them in turn. And each speaker will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions and answers and discussion. So let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Richard Sakwa. Richard Sakwa was Professor of History and International Relations at the University of Kent in Canterbury, and the author of many, many books on the Soviet Union and its relationship with the West, and of course of Russia and its current relationship with the West, including several important books about the Ukraine conflict. Most recently, his most recent book is The Russo-Ukrainian War, Follies of Empire, which was just out last month. And of course, back in 2015, just after the Maidan events, Richard, you published Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands. So Richard, please take it away. Thank you. Oh, and I have to ask you to unmute. Sorry, give me half a second, Richard. Okay, there you go.
Right, lovely. Thank you. And thank you very much for that introduction. I think that you've covered so many important issues there, and I hope that I can say a few words about that and the others as well. So I think it's a most important moment to be discussing these issues, given where we are today, and not just Iran, potentially over Cuba and so much else. So what I wanted to do is just to make a few points, to give the big picture, as it were, some concepts, some way of perhaps thinking about it. And the first one would just to stress periodization, so the time. And what I'm arguing, it seems to me now, is that 80 years after the end of the Second World War, after 1945, that we are let me put it this way, that we're once again in an open historical situation, that some of the glacis, some of the complete frozen character of the elements emerging after the end of the Second World War. You've mentioned the Cold War and such. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the emergence of the powerful US-led alliance system, all of that is in flux for various reasons. And of course, it's a moment of exceptional danger where our old guideposts are no longer making sense. And it's extremely difficult to get a handle on things. And within this, so we're talking about 80 years. It's not to say that the structures of power, imperialism have disappeared, by no means, but simply that the character, the way, the balance within the system is changing. And so this 80 years is coming to an end. Something new is emerging. And of course, this beast slouching to Bethlehem is a very ugly one indeed. And some people are already looking back already to the safety, the good old days of the Cold War. Can you believe it? That sort of element. Within those 80 years, I won't go into detail. I would argue that it went into two subphases. The first 40 years was embedding capitalism, embedding social relations within a welfare state, as Ruggie and others have argued, that the emergence of this welfare state, in part, as you've alluded to, the existence of the Soviet Union, the existence of a geopolitical and ideological rival, kept the political West, the collective West, on its toes, and of course, fear that the people would turn towards the alternative, given the manifest inadequacies of even the achievements of the welfare state, but obviously the failures at the same time, and of course the continuous catastrophic position in international affairs. So, and then of course, so over 40 years building welfare states, in the last 40 years dismantling them in one way or another, or certainly making them less effective. This element on this, still in this first element, is that the Fulton speech, Churchill's Fulton speech, of course, it did signal a Cold War, but at the time the emphasis was less on the thinking of Cold War, because it was, as it were, alerting the fact that it may well be emerging. But the focus, interestingly enough, was on the Anglo-American alliance, the special relationship, which Churchill made a lot of interest about. And that was the element to which Stalin responded, in particular, saying that the imperialists are coming together, and in his response, a little bit later in the Soviet media. That was the emphasis which he put on it. Nevertheless, the real Cold War, I think, could be signaled clearly. It was a long slide. Was in fact Truman's speech in March 1947, it seems, when his speech, in which was far more radical than Churchill's, because Churchill was trying to save something. With Truman's speech in March 1947, we were moving into a new phase entirely of that element. So that's a sort of the first point. The second one is, again, a point to which you've alluded, that after 1945, we saw the establishment of the Charter International System with the United Nations as its focus. Now, the establishment of the United Nations still generates an enormous amount of debate. The bottom line is, and I'm now reading and thinking about Mark Mazowa's book already well over a decade ago, No Gilded Palace, in which he actually very, I think, convincingly argues that as far as Churchill was concerned, despite his huge ambivalence, and indeed, of course, the United States' ambivalence about establishing what in those days was called a world government, of course it wasn't, or certainly the fear both in Washington and London that their freedom of action would be limited. But ultimately, the creation and the decision at Yalta, which it was Stalin insisted on, that the major powers had veto rights as permanent members of the Security Council, meant first that they had a buy-in, that they, as opposed to the League of Nations, which of course the United States in the end didn't join, and the Soviet Union very late. So the idea is to get them in. And of course, ultimately, in the midst of all those debates, as far as Churchill was concerned, in the early times, that the United Nations, the way it was formulated, would maintain the British Empire, which already at that stage was beginning to turn into what was called the British Commonwealth, including the British Commonwealth, including the dominions of Australia, New Zealand. So it was but the key point is that it took on a life of its own. That very early in 1945, decolonization was not on the agenda, but the fact that they established this framework, and the original charter, was not focused on decolonization by any means, just like the League of Nations temporized about despite Woodrow Wilson's 14 points on the national thing, it didn't apply to the non-Western, non-imperial powers, of course, and Europe. So, but the same thing, elements were in the original 1945 formulation of the United Nations, but that quickly changed, of course, under pressure of India and, of course, the Chinese Revolution and so much more, the non-aligned movement, 1955, and it very quickly. And that's a crucial point because today this international system, the United Nations, is under unprecedented attack. Not just simply the Board of Peace, which Trump, it's more or less explicit. We will establish alternatives. Some, and I think mistakenly, in Moscow and elsewhere, sometimes argue, it's not the official position by any means, arguing that we need to start again, that maybe BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, some other organization could be the alternative. Now, I can understand why people are saying it may be important to start again with a new international system. I disagree. I think that that there will be never any consensus. It simply won't work. So in other words, you abandon this, and there's nothing and no fundamental new ideas in the wings, except, of course, an expanded membership, including Africa, South, Latin America, and India, of course. And if India joins, I've mentioned this, and of course the Pakistanis get very upset, and so on and so forth. So this is the best we've got. But what this now, we're now at the point at which the United Nations does reflect normative multipolarity. All 193 states in the United Nations, and of course there's some 200 in total, are based on this important ideological principle of sovereign internationalism. It's a very dynamic concept that it's internationalism coming together from multilateral World Health Organizations, UNESCO, you name it, the 30-odd United Nations institutions, organizations, plus many more, much more. So this is, and of course, the United Nations is the source of legitimacy. So these wars are illegitimate and, of course, against international law in a fundamental sense. Without it, there'd be no rock on which you could stand in which to state that, apart from an abstract ethical or morality, which, of course, is important. Universalism, but at least we have an organization and a charter to which you can hold people's feet to the fire. It hasn't worked, but sometimes it's there, and without it, it'll be far worse. So it's a genuinely universal body. Now, my third point, and this is really to the imperial thing, is that after 1945, in parallel to this international system, which United States, United Kingdom did so much to establish, but it doesn't belong to them, and as we see, so as I saw, it took on a life of its own. At the same time, we saw the establishment of the political West. We could call it the collective West, the Atlantic Alliance system. It doesn't matter. I think the political West is important to call it that because it distinguishes it, but from everything, the other Wests, what Alan Freeman calls the Columbian West since 1492, or that is the explicitly imperial and colonial West, and indeed the cultural West going back to Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Persian, Babylonian origins. There are many Wests, but this West, and what I want to stress, is that after 1945, this US, UK, and then European alliance, this Atlantic Alliance, was, I don't think that the general public certainly understands just how transformative this beast, this political, this unique political formation was. It had two key facets to it, an outrightly imperial one, both within it, which was basically US hegemony over Western Europe, which has stymied its intellectual, strategic security and other development since then, but also the external factor that this political West has been a reformulation of imperial agendas in a different way, Francophonie, the British and such like. Of course, it also has a Commonwealth aspect, the Republican aspect, the public goods aspect, and this ideology, which in some ways, in other words, it's a contradictory political formation, but with an element. So in other words, it's certainly not monolithic, it has moments and contestation within it. But the key point is that the political West does to its member states what Chris Bickerton and my former colleague Phil Cunliffe at Kent used to argued, that just like membership of the European Union transforms the member states, well, nation states into member states. And this is a process of state transformation whose enormity we haven't fully got to, because the same thing goes on within this political West. And that's why you need to distinguish this political, cultural, security formation away from the other Wests. Because it claimed to be universal. As after 1989, 85, 89, it then began to subvert and usurp the Charter international system. And it bombed Belgrade and Serbia in 1999 without UN sanction. It went to war in Iraq in 2003 without UN sanction, and so on. So this political West claimed that its principles, end of history nonsense and all of that, it claimed a universality that only belongs to the genuine universality of the Charter international system. So this tension between the system and models of political order within the system. We used to have the Soviet model of socialist internationalism before. Then we had this political West with its model of liberal globalism. And I haven't got time to go into it, but I would distinguish that globalism is very different from internationalism. That internationalism is genuinely independent actors coming together on a voluntary basis. Globalism is the vision of empire and ideological expansion by hegemonic means and by different means. So, but I mean, one can say much more, but this political West is where we are today. Of course, it's changing fundamentally now. Obviously, the United States didn't want to be bound by the Charter international system. It's undermining its sovereignty. Now it doesn't want to be constrained by the political West. It's become a burden. And that's why I say we're into a new phase. Who knows whether it's going to last another 40 years? A new phase where the United States is shedding its own limitations and constraints within that political West established after 1945. And that's why this is really uncharted water. At the same time, movements like yours, ours, this IMG, and so much more peace movements I have in mind, are arguing for a better West, this fourth West, if you like. And so it's that better West, which would be perhaps a more humble and more modest actor in international politics, together with the global South and so much more. So I'll stop there, but it gives us a sort of framework in which we can start thinking about these questions. Thank you.
That was great, Richard. Thank you so much. And it's so thought-provoking because it makes me wonder. Anyway, sorry, I just lost my train of thought because I was thinking of asking Paul to please request Ken to unmute. But anyway, I'll come back to it. I'm sure it'll come back to me. But let me introduce our next speaker now. Our next speaker is Professor Ken Hammond. Ken teaches at the New Mexico State University, where he's in the Department of History. He has been one of the most distinguished historians of China, in particular in the United States. He has also, of course, visited China a great deal, having served as a research fellow at the Institute of History at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, and many other places. He was co-director of the Confucius Institute in New Mexico State University. Two of his more notable books were Pepper Mountain, The Life, Death, and Posthumous Career of Yang Jisheng, which came out in a 16th century figure, which came out in 2007. And his most recent book is China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future, which was published in 2023. So Ken, please go ahead. And I should just say that we've heard just now from a foremost thinker about Soviet and Russian, the Soviet and Russian role in the world, and now we are hearing from someone very attuned to China's role in the world. Ken, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you so much, Radhika. I'm delighted to be here. I love these webinars, and it's an honor to be taking part here today. Yeah, I want to shift the focus just for a bit over to Asia, particularly East and Southeast Asia, because I think that when we talk about the sort of reconfiguration of imperialism after the end of the Second World War, this is an arena in which we can see some things taking place that are maybe not quite such headline grabbers even at the time, but nonetheless really I think demonstrate the dynamic at the outset of this of what becomes the Cold War, this period between the end of 1945, 1946, and probably, let's say, 1949, by the time we have the victory of the Chinese Revolution. And I think that there's two fundamental dynamics that are going on within this moment, especially right after the end of the war. One that is fairly straightforward is the replacement of British leadership in the imperialist realm by that of the United States. This is, of course, a process that's been going on, as was mentioned earlier. After the First World War, the United States began to consolidate a new position. But it's really after World War II that the United States emerges as kind of the dominant power within Western imperialism. And in many ways, we can think of the Cold War period and subsequent dynamics of Western imperialism as an era of American hegemony, right? And that's something that is falling apart dramatically now, and yet it has shaped these last 80 years in very profound ways. The other dynamic, of course, which is really what we talk about when we talk about the Cold War, was this reversal, very quick, but also unfolding in sort of steps, in the relationship between the United States, in particular, the West, this political West, as was just suggested. I like that concept, and the Soviet Union and its allies, the Allied Socialist states. Because that, during the war itself, of course, the United States had to ally itself with the Soviet Union in the fight against fascism, in the fight to preserve its own imperialist interests, but also to defeat the threat of fascism and militarism, both in Europe and in East Asia. So these two dynamics unfold in tandem: the rise of America as the preeminent imperialist power, and the very profound shift from a period of alliance and cooperation with the Soviet Union to hostility to everything about the Soviet Union and everything even associated with the Soviet Union. So I want to just sketch out four particular cases across East and Southeast Asia that I think highlight just how profound a reversal, a change of course this all really was. And I'll start with China because, of course, China is kind of the biggest arena for all this. Because, of course, during the latter part of World War II, the United States, the American Office of Strategic Services, had sent a military advisory mission to Yan'an, to the headquarters of the Communist Party of China and the Red Army, what's called the Dixie Mission. And they spent quite not a very long period of time, but certainly an extended period of time, working with the Red Army, meeting with Chairman Mao, with Zhou Enlai, with Zhu De, and others there, and reporting back to Washington, suggesting that in the post-war period, as whatever the political dynamic was going to play out within China, that the communist movement, which was primarily focused on making changes in the rural economy, should be supported, should perhaps be brought into the conversation about China's political future. And that begins to change very quickly after the end of the war. And there's a period where the United States does engage in some diplomatic activities, trying to broker some sort of coalition government between the Kuomintang nationalists and the communists. But that falls apart fairly quickly. And then the United States pivots completely and puts its great military power, its assistance behind the nationalist government, behind Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang forces. That proves to be a fool's errand. And of course, as the Civil War progresses in China, even any voices that were raised within the American foreign policy establishment, trying to point out what the realities on the ground were in China, trying to suggest that this flat out support for the nationalists was probably in the long run going to be counterproductive. Those voices were ignored or silenced. And in the end, of course, in October of 1949, the revolution is triumphant. The People's Republic is established. A relationship between the People's China and the Soviet Union is launched with the Treaty of Friendship in February of 1950. And that just by that point, things have changed so dramatically that in the United States, we get this McCarthy era. We get just the darkest hours domestically of the Cold War, and anyone who spoke out in anything other than lockstep with this virulent anti-communist view about China was labeled as really basically as traitors. Many of the scholars associated with China studies either had their careers disrupted, some left the country. Owen Lattimore, very famously, going off to England, and the change there, the turnover that we see in the relationship with China is just so dramatic. The United States imposes its navy between the mainland and the island of Taiwan, just completely absolute hostility and antagonism for the new socialist government. Meanwhile, over in Japan, Japan, of course, had been part of the Axis, had been a terrible, terrible enemy of the United States, the subject of terrible racist propaganda during the war. And of course, Japan was the country upon which the atomic bombs were dropped. So we see with the occupation of Japan, we see another very dramatic reversal, a very dramatic transformation. And this is bound up with the emergence of the Cold War as well. Initially, in the first 2 years, 3 years of the occupation, there was a fairly progressive sort of tint, if you will, to the policies that the United States was supporting. The drafting of the Constitution, the peace provisions in the Constitution, things like that, but also the breaking up of the great corporate conglomerates, the Zaibatsu, a number of other policies, the release of left-wing political prisoners from prison where they had been held by the militarists. There's a period in the early days of the occupation where it's a fairly liberal, fairly progressive kind of thing. But by 1948, 1949, we see a radical change there. What's called the Dodge Mission, a Detroit lawyer who gets sent over by the United States to reorient the policies of the occupation. And this is what sets up the post-occupation dominance of what becomes the Liberal Democratic Party, which of course persists all the way down to our present day. And again, it's part of this reconfiguration of relationships with the Soviet Union, because Japan now comes to be seen as an ally. It comes to be seen as a base for imperialist military activities. First, of course, the Korean War, later the Vietnam War, and of course, American military presence in Japan, especially in Okinawa, continues right down to the present day, with a lot of friction and tension with the people on the ground there. So Japan is another case in which we can see this sort of reconfiguration taking place pretty quickly after the end of the war. And the last two things I want to touch on are kind of interlinked. I want to see them as a strong contrast. And this is the fate of European colonialism first in French Indochina and then in the Dutch East Indies, what becomes Indonesia. Because there's a dramatic difference in the conduct of the United States towards these two struggles. In Indochina, what returns to being Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. During the war, The Viet Minh had fought against the Japanese, the French colonial authorities under the direction of the Vichy government back in occupied France had collaborated with the Japanese. The Viet Minh fought against the Japanese, and as with China, the OSS sent a mission, the Deer mission, to help out with that, and they too gave very positive feedback about the Viet Minh and encouraged the American government to consider aiding them, helping them in their struggles after the war. But when the war comes to an end and Japan is defeated, the American government turns against the Viet Minh when in August and September of 1945 they come into Hanoi, issue the declaration, the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. Ho Chi Minh actually incorporates language from the American Declaration of Independence back in 1776 in order to send a sort of message, hold out a hand of friendship to the United States, and that's just slapped aside. And the United States positions itself as the great supporter of French imperialism in its efforts to return to Indochina. And after the defeat of France in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, the United States says, well, if you can't hack it anymore, we'll just take over. And of course, that leads to the Vietnam War and the terrible suffering that we inflict upon the people of Vietnam, and of course the eventual victory of the Vietnamese Revolution and independence for Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and their the course of their history ever since then. In contrast to that, we have the experience of the independence struggle in Indonesia, where Sukarno and Hatta were viewed by American analysts not as communists, but as sort of bourgeois nationalists almost. And so the United States puts pressure on the Dutch government, the post-war Dutch government, in, of course, the era of the Marshall Plan and all this assistance that's being pumped into Western Europe. The United States has a lot of leverage, puts pressure on the Dutch government so that Indonesia is granted independence in 1949. It's like the litmus test, the one thing that mattered was whether a post-colonial country would open itself up to American imperialism, to American capitalism, or not. If they would, then we would support their independence. If they wouldn't, or if they were allied with the Soviet Union, if the independence movement was led by socialists, communists, then everything had to be done to block that, and so the contrast between these outcomes in Indochina and Indonesia, I think, is perhaps maybe the most dramatic demonstration of the degree to which Cold War mentality, the Cold War assertion of American imperial dominance and hegemony, played itself out most dramatically. And I'm going to let it go at that. Be happy to look forward to the questions and answer period ahead.
Well, what I was thinking of in response to Richard's remarks, which were also brilliant. And I just want to say that it seems to me that the connecting link is France, isn't it? I mean, the political West depended on essentially presiding, insofar as the political West constituted American dominance over its own allies. It was happier, had an easier experience with the so-called defeated powers, with Germany and Japan. Whereas, of course, France was always the sore thumb that stuck out, and it was constantly fighting for its own imperial autonomy. A struggle that, to some extent, I think, still continues to this day. But anyway, I hope to I look forward to further discussion of this. But thank you, this was really great. Our next speaker is also, I'm sure, going to be fireworks for us. I'd like to introduce Dimitrios Konstantakopoulos, journalist, writer, editor of the prolific and always worth reading Defend Democracy Press. Dimitrios was former chief correspondent of the Athens News Agency in Moscow from 1989 to 1999. Member of the Secretariat of the Central Committee of the Syriza Party, former advisor Greek Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou on arms control and East-West relations, and many other things besides. One of the most engaging political interlocutors that I've ever had. So Dimitrios mentioned that the International Manifesto group was originally born in a Skype conversation between me and Dimitrios in the months after the pandemic started. Okay, Dimitrios, please.
Thank you, dear Radhika, for your very kind words. Thank you also for the invitation. Ancient Greeks have constructed the word truth from A and Lethe, that is, no oblivion. Don't forget the important things. This is the sense of truth, of identity. And I think that you're right also when studying this transitory period between the supposedly great anti-fascist alliance and the Cold War, to focus a little bit on Greece, given the fact that Greece is a kind of fractal, As Churchill put it, it is producing more history than it can consume. So here you can find in micrography all the main tendencies which are working on the world system. By the way, regarding the Cold War, in the sense not of a simple containment of Russia as this which was happening for centuries by the British, but in the sense of a total ideological, political, and from time to time military war, I think it was never really interrupted. It began in October 1917. The very creation of the Soviet state, the October Revolution was an unacceptable ideological and geopolitical challenge to the capitalist world and also to many Eastern regimes. So for them, the Soviet Union had to disappear. This was the goal. And here there is an asymmetry, because if for Russia under Lenin, the aim was the world revolution, it was not after Lenin. After Lenin, the aim was to find a common way to coexist with the West. And sometimes even one has the impression that the greatest ambition of Russian elites, be them post-Leninist Soviet ones or especially late Soviet ones and post-Russian ones, are to be recognized as equal partners of the West. Unfortunately, this is not possible. The West does not want, and it does not want even after 91, in spite of the transformation of Russia, because post-Soviet Russia remains keeps some of the elements of the Soviet heritage, for example, the nuclear arms, which give them some freedom and some possibilities which are unacceptable, especially in the new super imperialism system which is created. So the Cold War is continuing also after the end of the Cold War. It's the permanent parameter in the relations between capitalist West and Russia. But this asymmetry, the fact that the Soviets and the Russians have different ideas about what they want from the Westerns, and they don't even understand, sometimes the Russian leadership does not understand, or the Soviet leadership, what is the real end game. It does not want to understand. That creates very peculiar situations like the one Greece has lived in. Usually, this Cold War period has some periods of some intervals of, let me say, rapprochement or attenuation of the hostility. A partial case is the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, when at least Germany is making some some peace with the Soviet Union. Then we have the anti-fascist alliance. Then we have detente. Then we have the Gorbachev and Yeltsin period. In all cases, this has lasted for some period. The West has taken all the possible concessions from Moscow, and then they repeat the war in some forms against it. That is a permanent situation, and I think it is a structural symptom of the Western system. Now, speaking about Greece. In Greece, during the occupation, we had a very vast armed resistance movement developed, which was the largest in occupied Europe, proportionally to the size and population of the country. This movement was created by a number of pioneer communist fighters who only received a retroactive approval from the bureaucrats of the Politburo. And despite the intense opposition, they acted despite the intense opposition and even threats from the Greek bourgeois parties. They have profited from the fact that all Greek bourgeois parties were either sided with the Germans or they went to Egypt following the king and the British. This resistance movement was not in reality a resistance movement like the one in France, for example, or in Belgium, etc. It has developed into a huge national, social, and political revolution. A deep one. It created its own government, while in the liberated areas of the country, it applied a very democratic, popular self-government and justice system that to some extent resembles Yugoslav self-management. The National Liberation Front, EAM, held from, at the time the Germans began to leave from Greece, was occupying, controlling 4/5 of Greek territory, 80%. They had 1,700,000 members out of a population of less than 7 million. When Athens was liberated, EAM's army, the ELAS, the National Liberation Army, was a regular army numbering 50 to 70,000 men and women, to which should be added 50,000 from the reserve ELAS, 6,000 from the national militia, and even naval and air forces. The partisans were armed with weapons mainly taken from the Germans and the Italians. The Communist Party, which had about 203 members in 1941, reached at least 500,000 by 1944. The EAM revolution is one of the most important, deepest in European history, and it was mercilessly hunted by the British, the Americans, the Soviets, the Greek oligarchy, and even its own leadership. That is why official history in Greece and internationally keeps it as buried as possible. At the end of the German occupation, different estimations go, at the time we had no polls, go from 80 to 95% of the Greeks supporting the communist-led resistance movement. It is in Greece, really, that it begins a Cold War with a form of civil war, of Greek civil war. There is another civil war inside the left between the forces which are controlled, the bureaucrats who are controlled by Moscow, and the genuine revolutionary figures who do not want to obey the more and more irrational orders they receive from Russia. In reality, Churchill, who is maybe the most the politician with the most acute class consciousness in the West, so to say, and political vision, and who said, I remind you, in July 1941, when he signed the agreement with the Soviets, he said that the military alliance with the Soviets, he said that we remain hostile to communism. He did never say the opposite. In 1942, he's very anxious about the fact that the only serious resistance movement in Greece is dominated by communists. Because Churchill, from 1942, he's thinking to the post-war Europe, and he does not want to see a post-war Europe dominated by the Soviets. I can tell you that in an interview he gave to me in 1991, the Valentin Berezkov, who was the interpreter of Stalin in his talks, one of the two interpreters in his talks with Churchill and of Molotov with Eden. When I asked him about those negotiations in October 1944 between Russia and with Soviet Russia and Britain, he told me the British wanted so much Greece, and they knew they would not get it from us, that they gave us, without our help, that they gave us everything we asked from them in the Balkans. As I told you, in 1942 already, the British are threatening General Reservas to oblige him to go to the mountains and create another anti-communist resistance movement. They say that if he does not do that, they will betray him to the Germans. Zervas goes to the mountains, and in 1943 he begins the first civil war. The civil war in Greece began in 1943, not in 1946 or 7, as is established now in the West. In 1943, the EVES, that is the organization created by Zervas, makes an agreement with the 22nd German division. It makes a peace agreement, and then it attacks the communist organization, the most massive organization, Hellas. And there we see the first, so to say, split between the British Foreign Office and the British Army, because the British Army is more interested in fighting against the Germans. But the Foreign Office is more interested already in 1943, especially after the Stalingrad battle, to stop Russians from occupying Europe. Even there is one officer, but it is not clear, this incident. There is a British officer who comes in direct negotiations with the German headquarters in Greece. But we don't those archives, the British archives, are closed, and we don't know exactly what were those deliberations. So this is the first civil war, which stops after some months. EAM, the National Liberation Front, is developing. It is controlling, as I told you, most of the country, and this is a very serious problem for Churchill. He does not know how to solve this problem, and he cannot solve it without help from Moscow. In early 1944, the British are suppressing the anti-monarchist and anti-fascist uprising of Greek military in Egypt, and they confine them in concentration camps. In a memorandum to Eden on May 4th, Churchill says that if we want to prevent the domination of the Balkans from communism, we must raise the issue clearly with the Soviets, possibly even recall our ambassador from Moscow. He adds that the Foreign Office must devise the strongest attack against EAM so that it can be openly denounced. No help, weapons of any kind, or supplies should be given to it. All our help should be given to Zervas, and this should be increased. The Hellas people are the most treacherous, filthy brutes I have read about in official documents, and that is saying a great deal. I suppose that now they have been invited to join the new government. A brief truce is maybe necessary. In the meantime, let us prepare our cannons, for you must be sure that we shall arrive at a rupture with the National Liberation Front. In these words, spoken by the Prime Minister of Great Britain. 1 year before the end of World War II, the future of Greece is already outlined. What is about to happen to a European country that mounted the greatest resistance to the Nazis and was in an exemplary way destroyed first by the Nazis, then by the British and the Americans. The next day of this, when he receives this memorandum, Eden meets the Soviet ambassador to London, tells him that they will do as the Soviets wish in Romania, but asks him regarding Greece, which is under British administration, as he says, to publicly support the Papandreou government in exile in Cairo, or at least discreetly advise the IAM to join it. In a message to Roosevelt on May 18, Churchill assures him that the Soviets have agreed to take responsibility for Romania and to give us responsibility for Greece. Now I can go on in details on what happened afterwards, but I don't want to tire you and to abuse the time. I know that Radhika is a very, very strong moderator from my own experience. So I will tell you the main thing is the following. In July 1944, in May 1944, sorry, they organize a conference in Lebanon where they are inviting the resistance and all the political parties. Philby, I found sometime I was looking for the documents in the Dimitrov archives in Moscow, and I found a telegram by Philby which was saying exactly what will happen in Lebanon and then what will happen in Greece. They knew everything, and they have said to the Soviets. So they sign an incredible agreement, the resistance delegation in Lebanon, betraying completely the guidelines they had from their leaders. When they come back to when this is known in Greece, there is a revolt of the guerrillas in the mountains. The Politburo of the Communist Party is canceling the agreement, but there is a Russian military committee which comes to the mountains under Colonel Popov, and we don't know what they say, but we can suspect what they say from what happened afterwards. And also we have what the Russian ambassador to Cairo said to the IAM representatives, and he told them that it is better to go inside the Papandreou government. The Papandreou was the man who was liked by the British, and accept those terms. So after 1.5 months, the Politburo decides to accept this agreement. In September 1944, the National Liberation Army accepts to be under the orders of the British General Scobie. In 1944, the British come to Greece in October 12. At the same time, Churchill goes to Moscow to discuss about Greece, as I told you before. In December 1944, the communist ministers resigned because they could not, even the agreements they had done were not working. The next day, the British are organizing a Maidan-type provocation in Athens, in the Syntagma Square. They are killing many peaceful demonstrators. They are provoking a general uproar in Greece, and they are using it in order to begin the occupation, the bombing and occupation of Athens. At this very time, the leadership of the guerrillas of the National Liberation Front takes orders the main bulk of the army of the partisans to leave Athens, not to enter Athens, and to go to northeastern Greece. For 1 month, mainly young people of the reserve Hellas are fighting the British in Greece. They are even put dynamite under his hotel, Grand Bretagne Hotel in Athens, but when the Politburo of the Communist Party learns about it, they tell them not to blow up Churchill. In spite of the victory of the whites, so to say, and the British in December 1944, the main bulk of the partisan army still exists, and the popular support still exists. In February 1945, one day after the closure of the Yalta Agreement, when obviously Stalin has seen his agreement with Churchill, how to say, being
Reneged.
yes, we have the signing of the Varkija agreement, with which all Greek guerrillas were disarmed. And they
Dimitrios, if you could please wrap up soon.
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm not going to speak more because it is too much. But what I can say that then we have a chapter of white terror. We have well documented by the United Nations, and the third round of the civil war, which had terrible consequences for Greece, especially because it destroyed the best Greeks and it made the governing economic and political elite the collaborators of the Nazis. It was a moral also disaster. And as for the Soviet Union, I really don't know if that helped them to anything. And one last remark: sometimes when I see the way now Russia and China are trying somehow to calm down Donald Trump, I am wondering if they don't repeat the same thing, the same mistakes they did during the 20th century. Thank you very much, and excuse me for taking a little bit more time, but you know, it's my subject, it's my account.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dimitrios. I think that was very informative, and I think you reminded people of the profound tragedy of Greek politics. I think, well, Greece originated the idea of tragedy, and I has clearly suffered it in a major way itself. I suppose I can only say that you can look at this as tell the story of a series of betrayals, particularly by communist forces of progressive anti-imperialist causes, or you can see it as part of the weakness more generally of left and anti-imperialist forces, as being part of an interregnum where left and anti-imperialist forces are important enough to elicit opposition, but not strong enough to deal with that opposition. But nevertheless, I think that there's lots, you have given us so much to think about. I'm sure there'll be questions about it. Our next speaker is Dr. Oleg Barabanov. Oleg is the program director of the Valdai Discussion Club, and he's also academic director of European Studies at the prestigious GIMO University, which of course is Russia's diplomatic university, and professor at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Oleg's writing covers basically writing about left and right politics worldwide, on Eurasia, and on relations between Russia, China, and the United States. I should say that includes covering nuclear matters. So Oleg, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Radhika, for your invitation to the seminar. I'm glad to be once again at the International Manifesto group. From the Soviet perspective, if we took these years after the Second World War, maybe the most enigmatic or mysterious question is why Stalin stopped. Because the Greek situation that was described by Dimitrios brilliantly now, it's only one example of the Soviets, of Stalin, leaving their lives, leaving local communists to the mercy of their enemies. But Greece was not the major example. The major example was, let me say, Iran, because let's remember that starting from August 41, so just 2 months after the start of the German invasion on the Soviet Union, the USSR and the United Kingdom decided together for the joint occupation of Iran to stop the German influence there, to stop their pro-German activities there, and also to provide a shorter road for Lend-Lease from the United States to the USSR. So the Soviets occupied the northern part of Iran, the British occupied the southern part of Iran, and stayed there for the whole period of the Second World War. And sure, it's understandable that in the Soviet part of Iran, there were a strong communist party formed in those years. And there was also an ethnic movement because there were parts of Iranian Azerbaijan in the northwestern part of Iran, bordering the Soviet Azerbaijani Republic. And so there was a huge local base. There were also a kind of People's Republic proclaimed at the end of the Second World War in the northwestern Iran. But the Soviet left. Stalin decided not to clash with the British, not to clash with the Americans. The Soviets left, and all the communists were hanged. Absolutely mercilessly. Another example is China, because when the Soviet Union joined the anti-Japanese campaign in August 45, there were Soviet troops in all what was named Manchuria, traditionally now we name it Dunbei, so 3 northeastern Chinese provinces, Heilongjiang and so on. And the Soviet troops were there for surprisingly short period. Just a couple of months after the Japanese defeat, after the Japanese surrender, the Soviet troops left northeastern China, and the civil war between Kuomintang and the Chinese communists started, and northeast China became one of the key theaters of the civil war in China in those years. So why Soviet left from there, it's another mystery. And there was some other thing. In Europe, there was some plans of Italian communists, maybe organize a revolution, maybe we'll use the Trieste crisis for our purposes. Stalin was silent and doing nothing. And there are several possible explanations why he stopped. Maybe the main one, at least for me, it was connected exactly to nuclear weapons, because in 45, United States bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there was the monopoly of the United States in nuclear weapons. It is known, it's quite a known anecdote that during Potsdam-Berlin conference in summer 45, Truman informed Stalin about that we just exploded the nuclear weapon. Stalin remained a poker face man after that, but then he initiated the Soviet works on nuclear weapons. And we can debate, and there are many debates among the historians, whether it was the Soviet intelligence who provided the nuclear bomb to the Soviet Union, and whether they were the nuclear scientists of the USSR themselves. Maybe it was 50-50. For me, 75 for intelligence, 25 for scientists. But at least only in 46, the first experimental, very small nuclear reactor became operational in Moscow. And only at the end of 48 and beginning 49, the industrial scale reactor producing plutonium from the nuclear spent fuel became operational in the Ural Mountains. And so only in August 49, the USSR exploded its own nuclear bomb, and the American monopoly was broken. And in these years, in 47, let's say 48, there were several US plans in the Pentagon, in the National Security Council, that some military plans how to make war with the USSR now. And there were about 20 main Soviet cities indicated as target for nuclear bombing. And another thing which Stalin did very fastly in 49, after producing the Soviet nuclear bomb, was to organize a base and airfields for strategic bombers of the Soviet Union in the extreme far northeast of the USSR, in the Chukotka Peninsula, so just near Alaska, near Bering Strait, because there were no missiles for that time. The missiles appeared from 55, 57 or something, intercontinental missiles, and there were only strategic bombers at that time. And for the Soviet Union, it was a quite difficult logistical tasks how to reach the 48 states, so the main core of the United States, not Alaska, but let's say Washington, DC, or at least Seattle, with Soviet strategic bombers. So Stalin started to build this airfield in the extreme northeast. And after that, we see the huge change in the Soviet policy. Stalin transformed from a timid man between 46 to 49 to Stalin that we all knew, and the Soviet Union actively supported North Korea in the Korean War with Soviet pilots, through China with armaments and so on. And there were at least some initial deterrent towards against the United States, nuclear deterrent, because when General MacArthur wanted to use nuclear bomb on North Korea and maybe on China during the Korean War, President Truman refused to do it, knowing that the Soviets have some bombs already. So the first logic, the first explication is nuclear. The second one, that Stalin was more concerned on Eastern and Central Europe, the territory taken by the Soviet army at the end of the Second World War, given to the Soviet Union during Yalta and Potsdam conferences by Churchill, Roosevelt, and then Truman. And the main task was to organize some firm opposition of pro-Soviet communists in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, and so on. And for example, during the Second World War, I think in 43, the Comintern was dissolved by Stalin, but it was reintroduced under a new name, Cominform, Communist Information Bureau, in 48, but not to fight the US imperialism mainly, but to fight the Yugoslav communists, Josip Broz Tito, who clashed with the Soviet Union at that time. So to have what he already had, and not to see sometime further. And the third explanation could be, if I may say, if you allow to say me, that Stalin was trustful to his words to Churchill and Roosevelt and Truman. If they agreed that East Europe is yours and all other world is ours, and they shaked hands on that, Stalin was trustful to that agreement. And maybe also the last thing, that Stalin was quite cautious and suspicious towards nationalistic leaders rising in that time in various countries of Asia. For example, he didn't trust Jawaharlal Nehru at all. He said that he is a bourgeois puppet, anti-communist, and the USSR had nothing to do with new independent India. The same more or less about Indonesia. It was also after Stalin's death, when Khrushchev came to power, starting from 54, 55, that the USSR started its closer connections with new nationalist regimes in Asia and North Africa, with India, with Burma, with Indonesia, with Egypt. In Egypt, Nasser was hanging communists, and was putting communists to prison. But it was not a problem for Khrushchev, because for geopolitical reason, nationalist Egypt, anti-communist but nationalist and anti-Western Egypt, was a partner or an ally for the USSR. The same may be for Burma and to some extent in Indonesia. But Stalin, he was not inclined to some dialogue, to some rapprochement to new nationalist leaders in Asia and North Africa. So maybe I'll stop here. Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Oleg. That was really, again, so informative, really addressing the meat of the issue, particularly around the sort of betrayals stories that one can tell about the Cold War, and why, as you say, the framing question was excellent. Why did Stalin stop? I think that was brilliant. And there are so many questions. I have many as well. So we will go to, but let us now go to the next and final speaker. Next and final speaker is Professor Vladimir Schubin. Professor Schubin is the director of the Center for African Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He has written an enormous amount, particularly, of course, in Russian, but two of his English books that I can mention are Social Democracy and Southern Africa, which was published by Progress Publishers back in 1989 in Moscow. More recently, in 2008, he published The Hot Cold War, the Soviet Union and the Liberation Struggle in Southern Africa, which came out through Pluto Press and the University of KwaZulu-Natal Press. So, Vladimir, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah. So, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, to begin with, the very idea of the very term of the Cold War was not popular in our country in my years. We used to call it the anti-imperialist struggle with three detachments: socialist countries, working class of the capitalist countries, and the national liberation movements. And I think to a large extent it was correct, because the very idea of Cold War is a bit misleading. I would agree with Dimitrios when he mentioned, at least partly agree, that the Cold War started in 1917. You see, I can quote my old late friend Brian Balkin, one of South African communists, who used to say it started 1920-21, after the hot civil war in Russia, and people often forget, after the intervention of over 1,000 foreign countries into affairs of Russia. That's point number one. Point number two, I believe that if to begin to call the, sorry, speaking about the Cold War, we should not forget also the idea of so-called bipolar world. You see, people speak about bipolarity up to 1980s. But in my opinion, this bipolarity was visible from the 1950, this agreement with China, up to, say, mid, if not early 60s. Because, as you know, late 60s we already had serious problems, including some skirmishes on the border with China. And I can elaborate, but I will not do it now. The world became very much multipolar already. As soon as far as armed forces are concerned, you remember the de Gaulle withdrew French forces from NATO. As far as economic forces are concerned, already we mentioned the national non-aligned movement. By the way, it was not in 1955. Of course, it was later created. 1955 was Bandung, when China participated as well. So this is in short. And then what happened later, I believe that in the situation which we were facing after 1940s, in the early 1960s, there was no unipolar world as well. People often speak about unipolar world. Sorry to speak about personal works, but I wrote an article about the fallacy of unipolar world somewhere in late 90s, but when people publish it, they put question mark, you see. The editors put question mark. They didn't want to believe about the fallacy of the unipolar world. But I believe that now almost everybody believes that this is wrong, that the world is multipolar, or call it multi-center, or call it as you like, but that's the most important. Now, because I'm afraid time is short, I will have to say maybe a few words about Greece. You see, I am old enough to say that during the Greece Civil War, I was in primary school. So my memory is not as good as it used to be. But I do remember at least there was a series, what we used to call propaganda for Greek revolutionaries in Russia. I still remember the youth magazine with the front cover, young men and women with their machine guns, and the heading was, "They did not vote for the king." You see, that was the approach. And maybe just to illustrate how difficult it is to distinguish between the truth and the false, the fake stories, I can give you one example, just to show it. You see, the first head of the African affairs in the Communist Party of Soviet Union, or should I say one of my predecessors in this position, was Piotr Ivanovich Manchkha. And he was heading this section from 1961 to 1982. But before that, he was dealing with Balkans. He was one of the first to come to Albania, etc. And he told me, when we met before, that he was there in early 1942, crossing from Albania to Greece to attend a meeting, I think it was a Central Committee meeting of the Communist Party. They went by horse, and at the time when he, for the first time, understood that something wrong with the leadership, because Marcos Vafiadis was given a poor host. It was clear that he was not as respected as was supposed to be. So I think even before that clash, or call it was like between Zachariadis and him, there was this elements visible for Soviets. I'm saying it to show once again that many things were decided by the people themselves without any command from Moscow. And in this case, yeah, and of course, he told me how the Greek communists applauded when they heard that representative of the Communist Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party is present there at that meeting. And then one more point he also told me about. He was with Zachariadis when they went in I think it was September or early October 1949 to Sochi. And the people say that he met Stalin there. I'm not sure, at least Petr told me that they waiting. He contacted even General Vasik, who was head of Stalin's security. He said, don't worry, we know where you are. And finally they met Molotov, who was still the second man, though his, I think, importance was declining at this place. And they had discussion with Zachariadis, and of course it's 50 years now since I discussed with Petr Ivanovich, and my memory is not as good as I say it used to be, but I had a feeling, in fact I'm sure, that Zachariadis told him about Molotov about the decision to stop the civil war, and it looks like they have not informed Moscow before, or at least they have not got any, should I say, permission from Moscow. So Molotov was not too happy with this statement. It contradicts too many stories which is now written, but I do believe that, though it's not my field, of course, the Greece, but this is one of the examples of Cold War, so-called war, where we should not be reduced to Soviet and American contradictions, etc. And maybe I should end by referring to the book by Professor Westad, The Global Cold War. I am not idealizing it, but at least I believe that still the best book as far as Cold War is concerned, in the sense of showing the different stories from different countries and explaining that not everything was controlled by so-called superpowers. And now maybe one personal point, since you mentioned some books of mine. Next month, the book should be published in South Africa called From Cairo to Cape. You see, that's 30 years of our involvement in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shubin. That was another really informative lecture. So let us now go to the question and answer session. If you have questions, please use the raise hand function, which you should find under the reactions tab. I also think that there will be some comments that the various speakers would like to make vis-a-vis one another's presentations. So we have time for that as well. Let me just find the, hang on, where are the participants? Yeah, oh, there we are. So questions? Okay, yes, I see William David has, if you just do this, however, I may not be able to see you. So please use the raise hand function, but William, please go ahead. Oh, let me ask you to unmute. Sorry, 1 second. There you go. You should be able to unmute now. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Jolly good. Look, let me quote
very short passage by Francis Noel Baker about what we were really up to in the Balkans before we handed Greece to the Americans, of course. And this is what he wrote. Instead of helping to strengthen the Greek resistance of EAM by encouraging non-communist elements to join, we tried to weaken its influence to prevent it monopolizing the liberation movement by aiding its political opponents. The nationalists we tried to use were just those people with whom German propaganda against the Red Menace was most effective. And Goebbels was working night and day to prove that all resistance to the Germans was communist inspired, which is nonsense. Little wonder that so many of our so-called nationalist friends turned whistling. And that is exactly what it's about. Now, let me jump in with a related fact before I go to sleep. And this is about the Cold War. We need to understand that the Cold War, in a sense, began in 1791. Yes, when the warmonger British Prime Minister Francis Pitt the Younger, not Francis Pitt, William Pitt the Younger, lambasted and criticized Russia for wishing to divide up the Ottoman Empire. Now, as Guicciardini wrote, the same things return with new colors, because things have always been the same. The Cold War began a long time before we thought. We had our periods of cooperation with Russia to balance it against Germany, but things are just the same today. The past sheds light on the future. We should therefore remember the important role of atavism in the whole story and institutional personal matters. Because at the end of the day, it boils down to individual fanatics. That's all I've got to say as a historian who depends only on documents. And finally, as regards the so-called Churchill-Stalin postage stamp agreement, etc., many months before that, in fact, as you'll see from one of my comments, the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden in June 1944 had already said that we had agreed with the Russians that the Russians would let us take control in Greece. And it's absolutely true, as Mr. Barabanov said, that that was the reality. I've gone on for much too long, but I think all this comes from pure documents, which what I rely on as a dispassionate historian. That's it. Sorry to confuse you all, but I enjoyed that very much, and I thank you very much, and God bless all of you.
Thank you. No, that. It's important to raise the point, which I think that you raised, William, that, there's a certain element of Russophobia has always been present. And the best way that I can explain it is that essentially, rather than seeing Russia and its expansion to become the biggest state in the world as something positive, as something bringing peace to a very large chunk of the world, etc., capitalist powers had necessarily to see it as something to be opposed because it was territory that it could not easily dominate. And I think that that is, to me, the root of the Russophobia, but I think there are many ins and outs to which you are pointing, and that's very important. And I think that this is, of course, once again at play. But, and I think what the other thing you are saying is that this is part of the imperialism of the Western powers. And this is why we see the Cold War as playing a central role in the reconstitution of imperialism. So maybe we should go to the panelists now, but I have a question or two that I'd like to pick. So, I think that a number of presentations referred to, particularly Richard and Ken, you referred to the differences among the Western powers. So I think particularly from the point of view of today, of 2026, etc., if you were to look back on the Cold War period, how would you characterize not the unity, but the tensions, not the unity of the political West, as Richard, you called it, but rather the tensions that remained within them. And do you think that they may re-emerge today in a new context, and so on? So that's my first question. My second question is probably clearly directed to Oleg's question, but also I think relating to what Dimitrios was saying. And that is that why do you think, I mean, what exactly happened? What kind of changes does Khrushchev represent that you began to see a more, how can you say, less resistance to the imperialist project and so on? And this, by the way, also connects up with Vladimir Schubin's points that, you know, in Russia, the project was always seen not as a Cold War, but as an anti-imperialist project. So what change did Khrushchev bring about? Because it seems to me that your explanation, your sort of four-part explanation of why Stalin stopped is very persuasive, particularly, and it matches also what I understand to be the clear intention of the Americans of bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was precisely to scare the Russians and keep them in their place. And of course, as you rightly pointed out, after 1949, and remember, even in 49, the Soviet Union, they had the bomb, they had a few bombs perhaps, but their delivery mechanisms were not so hot. So, you know, it was still in a vulnerable position, probably right into the late 60s, early 70s. But anyway, those are my questions. And since there are no others, I'd like to go to each of the speakers, perhaps in the order in which they spoke, to give some comments, and feel free, of course, also to comment on each other's presentations. So, Richard, we'll go to you first. Technically we have 15 minutes, but I'll expand it to give at least 5 minutes to each speaker. So please go ahead. Sorry, I have to ask you to unmute. My mistake. There, I have asked you to unmute, so you should be able to unmute.
I've got it now, yeah. Lovely. Thank you. So I've got two things I'd like to say. The first one, thank you for your question about the tensions within the political West, this strange beast established after 1945, which lives to this day. And finally, it takes a maverick like Donald J. Trump to ask the sort of questions about the necessity for NATO, for the functions even of the European Union in this system. I'm not saying he gives the right answers, but I'm saying that it's finally somebody, a US president, is asking questions that should have been asked at the end of the first Cold War in 1989-91. But the big tensions, yes, there were always tensions. Obviously, the initial one was, of course, Churchill, who wanted to preserve the empire, and of course Roosevelt and then Truman, the United States, formally at least wants to dismantle it, not for any altruistic reasons, of course, but to have access to the market, to prevent what was very much on the agenda in those days. Certainly from the 1930s, the imperial preferences and so on. But afterwards, I'd say the big tension, which continues to this day and which haunts us since 1945, is the tension between Atlanticism, and this Atlanticism which Washington-based, US-led, which has had differential relations with its subjects. It's obviously the defeated powers, Japan and Germany. And then, of course, the core Western countries, what became the legacy great powers, in particular after Suez in 1956. Because don't forget, as late as 1955, in Geneva, there were three great powers, the US, UK, and the Soviet Union. And after Suez, no one mentions the United Kingdom again in the terms of the summit. The big tension is between Atlanticism on the one side and pan-continental Europeanism on the other. This was even on the agenda before the Cold War, so 45, 46, 47. If you recall, the final decision at Potsdam was effectively a united, neutral, disarmed Germany. And of course, and that was very quickly, and this is perhaps, along with the Greek Civil War was one of the other big issues, the status of Germany. And if Germany had remained united, neutral, non-aligned, demilitarized, then of course there wouldn't have been a NATO, there wouldn't have been a Warsaw Pact, there wouldn't have been a Cold War. And those debates, and we've now got more and more information about how the Soviet Union was genuinely, and it perceived, first of all, the moves towards the creation of a West German state, which finished in 1949, as a fundamental betrayal of Potsdam, not Yalta, which was more focused on other things, including United Nations. And so it was betrayal. And then, but this question of Germany is not over. We now know from the documents in the archive that in 1952, Stalin again came up with this German unification plan. Of course, the West always sees it as a plan to have a wedge between the two wings of the Atlantic Alliance, the West European one and the United States one. And this obsession with wedges, divided, and therefore you have bloc discipline as well, which is one of those huge functions of a Cold War. Anyway, so 1952, Khrushchev also, less so, but was serious about demilitarization of Germany. All the failure of this Stalin, and Beria, by the way, as well, before he was murdered or killed in end of 1953. And then, of course, the failure of that then led to Germany being joined NATO in 1955, and soon afterwards, as you mentioned, the Warsaw Pact defensively was established as part of that. So the fate of Germany was a fundamental issue, and some divisions about all of that. And then, of course, you have Gorbachev comes along, says, let's have from Lisbon to Vladivostok, common European home, powerful speeches. These were speeches, okay, not much follow-up, doesn't matter. And of course, all the way through to Putin and the Большая Европа idea, the Greater Europe idea, which he in particular emphasized as late as 2008 in a Berlin speech. So, but this is, today, we see this, that the obsession, first of all, that Germany has to be part of that Western alliance. Second, that we cannot have this pan-continental agenda, because that would mean bringing in Russia, Moscow, or Soviet Union, Russia. And after the end of the Cold War, we now see it was systemically, structurally impossible for Russia to join this political West because of the nature of the character. I can't go into detail now, all stacks of things, because it was a US-led alliance. And you cannot allow a subaltern to join it. If Russia joined, it would demand, quite rightly, a voice. It would then dilute US hegemony, leadership, the imperial project, which is the political West. So that's the first thing. And of course, the big challenge within that was from the Gaullist idea. Somebody mentioned already that de Gaulle's movement out from the NATO Unified Military Command in 1966, kicking out NATO's headquarters, of course, out of France to Brussels in that year, 1966. And then, of course, today we have this agenda again on the table. As I said, there's an open historical moment. It's exceptionally weak, but we see, first of all, the so-called right-wing populists, AfD, Sarah Wagenknecht, even Farage, before he was squashed down in July 2024 in our last UK election. He said, well, it makes sense to get on with Russia. This is the Trumpian line. And so Trump is saying things, which is the one big thing which we would say Trump got right, in a sense that and today there's still talk of a new détente, United States and Russia. And that's one reason why people would argue Russia is pulling its punches now in these various conflicts, because there's still this sort of mythical vision that, I think most people are disillusioned with Trump by now, but nevertheless, it's still, the Kirill Dmitriev is still continuing the Alaska agenda of a new détente. So it's there. Obviously, it's crazy figures, a $13 trillion investment and so on. But again, a Russo-US détente would bypass what, in my view, as the last Gaullist in England, as I've said before, is this pan-continental vision from Lisbon to Vladivostok, because Russia today is obviously moving. It's a post-Western political formation, but it cannot be a post-European political formation. It is a European state. The culture is European. Everything is European in Russia. So I distinguish between being post-Western and post-European. It's not post-European. And this European reunification agenda is very much on the agenda, but not a Brussels-centered reunification, but also possibly a transformative, not from the right, which is interesting. It's a main focus, but from the left. And it'd be interesting to see what in the UK, our dear friend, I say that, Zach Polanski, the head of the Green Party, who's highly ambivalent in all sorts of ways. And the failure of your party, Jeremy Corbyn, who also gradually began to ask these sort of questions, and we know the enormous pressure against it. And that, I know I can't go on, but the final thing on the Cold War. Yes, the Cold War, when did it begin? I think, first of all, define a Cold War. And a Cold War can, in my view, is only, it's a conflict, great power, another conflict in conditions of in the nuclear age. So Russophobia, tensions, great power conflicts have been, endemic, universal over history. But what makes it specific today is the nuclear shadow, that if the great powers do go to war, but we're closer today than ever before, by the way, of course, it's, in other words, this nuclear factor, which is what makes great power conflict in our age today a Cold War, quite apart from the ideological mobilization, the demonization of the enemy, and all of the other elements in those conditions. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. I just can't help but say three quick things. Of course, how serious is Trump about, befriending Russia? He has, moved in all sorts of directions, and so on. So I think, particularly vis-a-vis solving the Ukraine conflict. Secondly, I think that if the Dmitriev project wins, will that not amount to a resubordination of Russia to the to Western capitalism, and inviting once again the moment of the 1970s? I think that one wonders whether this is what would happen, or perhaps you will say that, you don't cross the same river twice, that things have changed, Putin has stabilized things, but if you strengthen that element within Russia, then it will weaken the part the part on which Putin rested in order to stabilize Russia after the 1990s. And finally, what of its whatever it is called, I forget the exact words, but the alliance with China, if this, because remember, part of saying that we should not make an enemy of Russia is to say, forget fighting with Russia, let's focus on China. But now Russia, China are aligned. Indeed, people are now saying that the new RIC, that is, the old RIC was Russia, India, China. Now the new RIC is Russia, Iran, China. So there are so many questions. As you say, it's an open historical moment. So many things to look out for. Okay, the second second speaker is Ken Hammond. Ken, I've asked you to unmute, so you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, I think I have. Okay, good. Yeah, in terms of thinking about, we obviously, I talked a lot about American hegemony and all that, but as you quite correctly noted, there's certainly tensions within the old imperial powers as well. I mentioned already the idea that the U.S. pressures the Dutch to get out of Indonesia. But as you suggested, Radhika, France is really kind of the most interesting example of this. And that can take us to another realm that we haven't had a chance to talk about too much, and I'll be very brief on this, which of course is Africa. Because, of course, during the Cold War, especially in the decolonizing and then early post-colonial period, much of Africa is a great arena for struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. But France continues to play its own special role, especially in West Africa, not only with Algeria, but even after the independence of Algeria. the French currency, the West African currency, the fusion of what had been French Central Africa, French West Africa. Even today, although that is in a period of great flux right now, French forces have been expelled from some of the countries, but still have a presence in others. And the French certainly have a very active diplomatic, political, and military agenda directed towards West Africa, which makes that an arena, of course, in which right now American imperialism is also very interested in its various ways. But it just the rivalry, the Gaullism, all that with the French certainly persists, and it would be very interesting. It will be very interesting coming up on next year's presidential election in France to see how that's going to play out, whether the far right, the Le Pen thing is gonna finally triumph, or whether the left will be able to once again forge some kind of unity and push back against that. That's an open question. But I think that France's, the British obviously after World War II opted for the special relationship and have subordinated themselves to the United States pretty thoroughly throughout this. The French, on the other hand, have, while needing American assistance, having American assistance in Indochina, once they walked away from that, really began to chart this effort to go their own way. And they can't do that entirely. And certainly Macron, although he says various things at various times, has not really taken France very far from the United States. But nonetheless, especially in Africa, their position has remained rather special in its own way. And I think that that's something that is interesting to contemplate for the time going forward. So I'll let it go at that because I know we have time pressures.
Sure. Thank you so much. And again, there's just, is the political West a result of the fact that individually none of these countries could try to manage imperialism, and so they have to kind of bandy together, because even Trump goes back and forth.
Yes.
Today he doesn't need NATO, and then tomorrow, like, where's NATO when you want them to help with the Persian Gulf, with the Straits of Hormuz, etc. So he's also going back and forth. But anyway, really interesting. Dimitrios, you are next, and I have also asked you to unmute. Yeah.
Yes, by the way, I think you have put me a question, but at that time the audio signal was a little bit perturbed. Is it true? There was a
Yes.
question.
Well, I was just saying that it was connected with the the Greek Civil War, the betrayal that whose story you laid out. Do you agree, for example, with the Oleg's understanding of why did Stalin stop, and what do you make of that, and how do you see that vis-a-vis the Greek situation in particular?
Yes, I appreciate very much Oleg, and I understand that he's trying a little bit to rationalize the behavior of Stalin, which seems to be rather irrational. But I have some questions there. There are two questions. First, I think the reason the Americans did not use the nuclear arms was not the one or the other policy of Stalin, was the fact that the Soviet Union had an enormous political capital after its victory against the Nazis. It was politically impossible for the Western leaders to wage a war. General Patton wanted. First, Dulles was making negotiations with Germans to change camps. Many such things have existed, but they were politically impossible. But unfortunately, the Soviet Union, after Lenin's death, especially during Stalin, knew only hard power. It did not understand very well smart power. Anyway, and by the way, why the fact that they have ordered the Greek communists to commit suicide, provoking a bloody civil war, has helped the defense of the Soviet Union. If they had more friendly forces around the world, they would defend more effectively against imperialism. No, I think the problem is much deeper, and it is happening even in 1923. We see that Moscow is practically Of course, it pays always tribute to the World Revolution, which is one of the main centers of Lenin's policy, but it quits that. In October 1923, it orders the German communists to stop the German Revolution, which they were ready to launch. Stalin takes power, and his slogan is socialism in one country. And I don't think he wanted any other socialist revolution. At least he did everything not to exist. And when they existed, those revolutions, and there were quite autonomous powers, like in Albania, in Yugoslavia, in China, he was always against them. We had clashes between the Soviets and those regimes, which were a product of genuine revolutionary process, not of the Red Army going to their countries. What to say now? That he even in China in 1927 he made the Kuomintang a member of the Comintern, and the result was that they slaughtered all Chinese communists in 1927. But this was maybe a useful, dramatic but useful experience for Mao, and he did not follow Stalin when he said to him that he must make a compromise with Kuomintang, and we had at least the Chinese Revolution. In Yugoslavia also there was a wing of the party which was very much controlled by Stalin and which wanted for Tito not to take power but to take a kind of compromise with... Unfortunately in Greece we did not have neither Tito, neither Mao. We had Zachariadis, and we don't have any, there is no doubt, Zachariadis was appointed by the Comintern, by Moscow, to lead the Greek Communist Party in 1931. And there is no doubt, at least this is what he says, and nobody says the opposite from the official documents, that what he did in Greece, he did, he said that in his defense, he did on orders of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, believing that he's doing his internationalist duty. By the way, the British have searched maniacally in Germany to find him because he was in Dachau. They found him, they put him in a military plane, and they transported him to Greece. What he has done in Greece, he has condemned and driven to the death the leader of the real leader of the National Liberation Front and of the National Liberation Army. This is the work of Zachariadis, and I don't see how anyone can dissociate this from the Soviet policy. Unfortunately, you know, in 1991, during the last years of Perestroika, I was defending the Soviet Union. I was defending its legacy, and I was advising my Russian friends not to idealize so much the West. But I cannot, in order not for this to go to the other extreme and idealize the Soviet past, because it's not ideal. If it was ideal, the Soviet Union would not collapse, simply. It did not collapse out of objective reasons also, but also because of political choices. And by the way, you are right, Oleg. I think that Khrushchev and Andropov were much more Bolsheviks than Stalin himself. Stalin hated communists. The proof, I understand that it's a little bit difficult to believe it, but the proof for that, he exterminated more communists than Hitler. What else? He exterminated all the close associates of Lenin. And you know, Jean-Jacques Marie, the French historian, he's writing that he was programming a fourth Moscow trial, when he would bring to Moscow all the leaders of the communist parties, and he would execute them. Not to speak about what happened to the German communist leaders whom were expelled and given to the Gestapo. So it is a really crazy phenomenon, this. But I think it's a bad, a bad service to us and to Russia to change the reality.
Thank you so much, Dimitrios. Again, a lot of food for thought. Yeah, but in the interest of time, let me go to Oleg, the next speaker. And Oleg, let me ask you to unmute. You should be able to unmute now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And Radhika, returning to your question on Khrushchev, there is a very simplistic answer. And then I pass from a simplistic one to more deeper reflection. Because with Khrushchev liberalization, first political jokes appeared in the Soviet Union. And one of them was, the question is, could you name 3 Soviet leaders whose surname starts with letter T, like team? The answer is, the first is a titan, Lenin. The second is a tyrant, Stalin. And the third is a tourist, Khrushchev. So he just loved travel, and not as a tourist for sure, but just in comparison with Stalin, after Stalin came to power, I think it was the only time that he left the Soviet Union was 2 times, one for Tehran conferences in 43 and another one for Potsdam conference in 45, and that's it. And Khrushchev traveled a lot, and maybe I like what Dimitrios said now, that Khrushchev was a real Bolshevik. At least he had some passion, some, let's say, favor in his mind. And but he started also, let's remind it that in 54, Khrushchev made an application for NATO. And it was, I think it was not trolling like Putin did in the early 2000s. Maybe it was genuine. And the application was taken very negatively. Then there were the Geneva talks in 54. Our colleagues already mentioned them, and nothing. And after that, he decided to make more contacts in the non-West, in Asia than in Africa. And it was also a domestic thing, because between 54 and 57, mainly Molotov criticized sharply Khrushchev for his foreign policy, for his opening to non-communist countries, because Molotov remained firm to Stalin's position. The communists are with us, the communists who are not with us, we exterminate them, but non-communists are not with us, absolutely. And one of the reasons for unsuccessful attempt to coup d'etat in 57 against Khrushchev, taken by Molotov, Malenkov, and others, was exactly his foreign policy. Then became a kind of euphoria because the economy was growing. The new missiles appeared starting from 57, the space exploration and so on. Khrushchev proclaimed communism coming into reality in 1980 in the program of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 61. So in this euphoria, I think he was genuinely thinking that the world is changing. The nationalist leaders in Asia and then in Africa have many things to say. And the future belongs to them, and it's in the interest of the USSR to support them and to be with them. Sure, there were some excesses, and Khrushchev was not also firm in its position. The first example was the independence in the Belgian Congo, so DR Congo now, Congo Kinshasa. Zaire previously, when there were a terrible civil war immediately after passing it from the Belgian colony to independence in 59. Khrushchev at the beginning was thinking that the USSR will influence. He sent some military, some navy to there, but then he stopped when he understood that there could be some not good thing for the USSR to be directly involved into the crisis. But then the second example is the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev first convinced Castro to put the Soviet missiles in Cuba, then decided, okay, let's forget about it. And Castro became strongly disillusioned with the Soviet Union after that, started his rapprochement with China, and so on. And there is another example. For example, in 1960, could you imagine that there were debates in the United Nations on decolonization of Africa and also on disarmament? And Khrushchev spent a month and a half in September, October 60 in the United States, in New York and in other cities. Can you see that the prime minister of a great power has nothing to do for more than 1 month staying in the United Nations? But Khrushchev did it. So it was a very, very specific kind of a political personality. Maybe he was not Bolshevik by ideology. I think he didn't understand. He was not understanding the Marxist ideology so deeply, but he was a kind of a revolutionary by passion, by heart for me. Thanks.
Thank you. That's also so informative about aspects that, I mean, one normally contrasts Stalin and Khrushchev in many ways, but you are also, what you are saying also points to some deeper continuities as well. So anyway, interesting. Finally, Professor Vladimir Schubin, let me ask you to unmute as well. Where are you?
I think I'm on mute.
There, yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, great.
Look, I think time is short now, so I will perhaps concentrate on one point. We speak about Stalin, sometimes exaggerating his policy. We speak about Khrushchev, but what about Malenkov? You see, it was not so easy, you see. The departure of Stalin, at least for a year, or maybe a year and a half, the real leader was Malenkov. Khrushchev was elected as the first secretary of the Communist Party, not the general, but first in September 1953, 6 months after Stalin's death. Moreover, in his speech in August 1953, Malenkov spoke in a very, very, how to say, polite way about foreign policy. And then he mentioned even the possibility of nuclear disaster. After that, after a year or so, maybe 2 years, Molotov spoke against this point. He didn't criticize him directly, but it was clear that the point was like, whatever humanity will suffer, imperialism will know more, blah, blah, blah. But Malenkov's policy at this definitely was rather peaceful. So to add everything to appoint Khrushchev would be wrong, you see. It's almost forgotten now, the name. But still, of course, he also his own problems, I mean, participation in some repressions in the 40s or 50s, that was also there. And the second point also, with Stalin and national liberation movement, it's also a bit more complicated, because recently I had to, as an expert, you see, had to review the project about our policy towards India, when the author of this project specifically about, as he put it, maybe in the wrong one, post-Stalin period, later Stalin period, that we had some contacts, mostly concerning the Korean War. You know that India participated in certain aspects in the finding solution. And at that stage, I mean, just before the Stalin death, the situation was also changing maybe vis-a-vis those national liberation moments. That's all I want to say. Maybe the last point maybe, look, maybe it's a bit too strong, but in my younger years, they used to speak about the next war will be between capitalist countries, you see. And then after Khrushchev, it started to be ridiculed even these things. Why they should? But what happens now? I don't want any war between them. But with Trump and NATO, sorry, the rest of NATO, maybe that idea of those years was not so wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shubin, so much. Thank you to all the speakers for an absolutely fascinating set of reflections. I would very much like to suggest that everyone who was here, who found this webinar useful, please share this widely, because not only do we have lots of people who participate in the Zoom, we've had 50 or so people watching on the YouTube channel. And we hope, of course, that after the event takes place, lots more people will watch it. So if you like this, please share widely. And for the rest, please watch out for our next webinar. We haven't finalized the next one yet, but there should be one soon in early to mid-May. So we look forward to seeing many of you there. Thank you so much and goodbye until next time. Bye-bye.